Introduce yourself.
I'm Jason Glenn. I am Associate Professor in the Department of History and Philosophy of Medicine, and also one of the co-directors of the Repair Project here at KU, along with Dr. Bridges and a lot of other great people.
Great. So this is our last discussion of the book, The Social Life of DNA, Race Reparations and Reconciliation After the Genome by sociologist Alondra Nelson. And we always like to start these book discussions with just a reminder of why we have a group like this now going on 4 years. And that is to understand the history, patterns, and systems that have led to current day racial health inequities. And so it's also a place to practice talking about racism and racial inequities. It's a place for personal learning and growth to create a shift within ourselves as individuals that are also part of the larger system, and to provoke an emotional state, whether that be discomfort, empathy, outrage, whatever it is that ultimately raises our consciousness as we try to uncover racism at play in the past and today, ultimately to commit to action and systems change to get rid of health inequities. So that is why we're here. That is the purpose of our book club. So we just wanted to kind of remind, we skipped actually last month, should have been our third. There were some scheduling conflicts, and so we didn't have a third discussion of this book, but we just wanted to kind of to remind everyone in what we're talking about here really is the use of these direct-to-consumer ancestry tests and sort of this ancestry linking genetics in terms of race, the way that it's used, and kind of the dangers of talking about genetics and ancestry in terms of race. And so she points out, the social life of DNA, as the author says, is that the double helix now lies at the center of some of our most significant issues. And that is identity formation. And we know the uncovering of, the hereditary linkage, and this is uncovering family secrets, historical debates. We know civil and criminal court cases, both criminal conviction and exoneration, and philanthropy and socioeconomic development projects. And the last time we met, we talked a lot about these reconciliation projects. So bringing family members together. And there was a case of, where many children were kidnapped and then they were able to show relation and return. And just also the way that we'll kind of talk a little bit today in the way that these types of testing and ancestry linkage was attempted to be used in the case for racial reparations for slavery. So I just wanted to let Dr. Glenn remind us, of a few things that we talked about in our first session.
So just wanted to get a handle on all that we are talking about when we talk about genetic inheritance tests, and to really sort of break a lot of that down, right? And what it means. There's a lot of confusion about whether or not you can do a genetic inheritance test and it tells you your race, right? So there are 3 types of genetic inheritance tests. One using mitochondrial DNA on the X chromosome or the maternal line. It's what your mama gave you, and what your mother's mother gave her on down the line. There's also Y chromosome DNA on the paternal line, which your daddy's daddy gave you. And there's also admixture mapping by ancestry informative markers on the non-sex chromosomes. And Alondra Nelson does a good job of giving us sort of the historical overview of the development of some of these technologies, or sort of the enhancement and refinement of some of these technologies involving the discovery of African burial ground in New York City, late 1980s, early 1990s, and the development of AfricanAncestry.com, the company behind the director Kittles, who was one of the major players in figuring out refinement methods for testing quote unquote ancient DNA. Next slide. So all of this really dovetails well with sort of the history of the ideology of biological determinism. And so I want to deconstruct that a little too, right? Because all of our knowledge about genetics and all of our thinking and imagining about genetics actually was beginning to form before Watson and Crick actually discovered the double helix form of DNA strand, right? And so when we think of biological determinism, a number of principles are at play, right? First and foremost, that humans differ in fundamental abilities, right? Next point would be those differences in fundamental abilities are due to innate genetic variations that are inherited, right? The next point is that hierarchies in human achievement are the natural results of our innate genetic differences. This is really the core of biological determinism, as it has manifested itself in the US for now much more than a century. And next point, sort of the conflation, right? Here's what makes it possible. The conflation of physical traits that do have some genetic variability, i.e. eye color and height, with social characteristics such as economic status, educational attainment, musicality, etc. And the assumption is that since there are genes at play in your eye color and height, there must be also genes at play in your economic status, educational attainment, musicality, etc. Next slide. So what is the link between biological determinism and race? And really want to put that out there as well. The history of biological determinism is inextricably intertwined with the history of race, the colonial history of the world, of the Americas, and how we all came to be here in this space, in this time. Next point. Race is the assumption that a few specific phenotypic features are good proxies for innate biological differences between groups so defined as races, or that our physiognomies, right, are good proxies for our genetic differences. And this is not to say that there aren't a handful of genetics at play in our physiognomies. However, right, the handful of genes that are at play in the development of our physiognomies are minuscule compared to overall variation between humans, right? And it doesn't fall along the same lines as we have used physiognomy as a category, right? But to see the world racially is to be immersed in a world of biogenetic determinist thought, right? And that's what we are trying to unthink. We're trying to unthink that and unpack that, deconstruct that with this book club, with the 6-part educational series, with everything that we're doing in the Repair Project, really trying to unpack, right, we're like fish in water when it comes to biological determinist thought. Next slide.
Okay.
Oh, and this we turn over to Dr. Bridges.
Yeah,
Oh.
we can turn it back over. I was trying to answer the question in the chat. Maybe you can do that while I'm talking about what is repair. That's a great question.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so we wanted to talk about kind of the history a little bit, touching on in chapter 6 called Acts of Reparation. She talks about attempts that have been made to repair or make payments or some sort of financial restitution for the horrors of slavery, which is a huge act. She says, every generation of African Americans has its reparations struggle. Collective memory of chattel slavery grows dimmer as the years since emancipation pass. But the drumbeat for restitution to amend the intergenerational devastation wrought by racialized human bondage persists, sounding with renewed intensity in each decade, despite historical amnesia. By the end of the 20th century, the double helix had become a part of this call for reparations. So I just wanted to point out a little bit of a timeline here, because some of this I knew and some of this I did not know the full story. So I remember hearing, during the Civil War and when enslaved people were beginning to be freed, that there was this act to actually, I mean, this sounds so horrible, to actually give reparations to the quote, I put the quotes here, it wasn't quotes, owners of enslaved people. And so in 1862, the District of Columbia Compensated Emancipation Act gave $300 to former quote owners of enslaved people for each person that was freed. And so originally sponsored by a senator from Massachusetts, the act freed slaves in the District of Columbia and compensated owners for $300. And there were 930 petitions granting freedom and money to nearly 3,000, for nearly 3,000 former slaves. And then I'd also heard this, but not the full story, that in 1865, General William T. Sherman and the US Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, met with 20 Black leaders in Savannah, Georgia, and determined to issue the Special Field Order number 15, stating that freed slaves or enslaved people would receive an army mule and not more than 40 acres on coastal plains of South Carolina and Georgia. And so this is that 40 acres and a mule promise that many of you probably have heard of. But the part I didn't realize, and probably learned it but didn't stick in my mind, was that so that was in January, and by June, 40,000 Blacks had settled on 400,000 acres of land. But then President Johnson and the Confederate landowners all took it back, and they actually appointed a committee of Black freedmen to figure out how they were going to give all the land back. So all of it was taken back. I didn't realize that part. I had always heard the 40 acres and a mule. Okay, so then she kind of touches on some other attempts at reparations. So she says in 1894, and then this spanned more than 20 years, there was this group, the Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association, that formed. And she said that one of the most important leaders of this group was a former slave, a mother, a widow named House. And House, this all kind of culminated in House bringing forth a class action lawsuit by 4 former slaves, people who actually themselves were enslaved, against the Secretary of the Treasury at the time, William McAdoo. And this lawsuit failed, however, because of the idea of sovereign immunity, which states that the US cannot be itself made party to a lawsuit without its consent. So this was the way that they were able to block this. She points out another movement more towards the middle of the 1900s and 1957, Audley Moore, who herself was a granddaughter, so a direct descendant of enslaved people, was able to get petitions of more than 1 million signatures, and petitioned the United Nations, petitioned President Kennedy, because she had read that there was a statute of limitations that if you don't before 100 years present your case, then it won't be taken seriously. And so she attempted at this time just shy of 100 years, but both of those attempts failed. Just wanted to point out that in 1988, the United States did give reparations under the Civil Liberties Act, um, $1.2 billion in repair for Japanese Americans that were interned in World War II. And then in the 90s, she points out there were some court cases that tried to evoke this precedent set by the Civil Liberties Act, but they failed. And at that time, it was statute of limitations and failure to show a direct line for personal injury. And then Nelson talks in the book about the use of DNA in these ancestry markers in attempts for reparations. So she talks a lot about Farmer Pellman, who's a lawyer herself and an activist. And in 2002, to get around this idea that you can't directly sue the United States government because of sovereign immunity, that they would instead sue large corporations like Aetna, Lloyd's of London, New York Life, Union Pacific Railroad, and many others who actually had profited for hundreds of years from slavery, either through insuring enslaved people or transporting enslaved people, or by the sale of cotton or other products from the work of enslaved people. And so rather than directly suing the US government, however, this failed according to the courts due to a lack of standing because they weren't either formerly enslaved themselves or a direct descendant of formerly enslaved people, so that this did not prove personal injury by simply alleging a genealogical relationship. So in 2004, Farmer Pellman turned with her other 7 plaintiffs to the use of genetic ancestry tests from the company African Ancestry to link themselves to ethnic groups and nation states in Africa. However, the court again said this failed to determine. They said that genealogical links are not evidence of personal or familial injury. So again, another fail. Dr. Glenn, do you want to talk about reparations in general? Any of these?
It's like where to start.
I know.
There's a lot of you might be familiar with, and Alondra Nelson references Ta-Nehisi Coates' 2014 essay on the case for reparations. And there sort of lays out that the case for reparations is not only based on slavery itself, but really based on sort of the totality of insults, injuries, and exclusions that has happened as a result, not just of slavery, but of Jim Crow segregation, of all the exclusion from everything from the GI Bill when it was originally passed, not being eligible for Black veterans of World War II, the unpaid pensions for Black veterans of the Civil War, even unpaid pensions for Black veterans of World War I, the discrimination that took place in the Homestead Act, which actually allowed for a lot of the population or repopulation of like the Kansas Territory when it was first acquired by the United States, that evicted millions of Native Americans off this land and promised up to 150 acres for settlers who would come in and improve the land. But Black Americans were largely excluded from that, right? And then you think of all the economic hardship that has been caused from segregation in the economic sector, in the education sector, even when we go down our own hallway here, and there used to be the portraits of all the graduates from all the schools over all the years, and you see all the years where people of color were historically excluded, and you think about all the family wealth that was denied persons who could not attain, right, like higher paying jobs in fields like medicine, in fields like law, etc. Right? The case for reparations, though, as a society and how we dealt with it, has always been to sort of find ways why we don't want to go there. And I think a very prudent discussion point would be to ask sort of what's at stake in reparations discussions, right? Why has it proved so fearful? And also, as has been raised over and over again, right, that it's almost an impossible debt to consider. And if it's an impossible debt to consider, what does that really mean, right? How can we conceive of reparations beyond the monetary reimbursement if it's an impossible debt to consider on monetary terms? Like, what would it take, right, to set things right? And given that there have been other attempts at reparations for Japanese Americans, for Native Americans who have been wronged, and looking at the pluses and minuses of those efforts, right? So really for Americans to sort of grapple with this history, I think has been the point of the reparations discussion. What does it mean for us to honestly grapple with the history of how we came to be? And in acknowledging that, almost everything we have in the United States, all the wealth that we enjoy, right, is sort of based on this history of abuse and exploitation.
She quotes Coates in the book, like you said. So I'm just going to read this briefly because I found it. This Ta-Nehisi Coates. She says that he advises, quote, "The idea of reparations is frightening, not simply because we might lack the ability to pay. The idea of reparations threatens something much deeper, America's heritage, history, and standing in the world. Reparations, by which I mean the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences, is the price we must pay to see ourselves squarely." All right, so I wanted to switch gears just slightly, but I think we will continue this conversation at the end here in the discussion. But I wanted to touch on this idea of the social dangers of DNA science and genetic research, and the way that we use, genetic ancestry, the way that we teach about it. So she says, in this new time, genetic science can be friend or foe. It can exonerate or convict. It can be a bridge to Africa or underscore the bittersweet European ancestry of many Blacks in the United States. In this book, I have explored the interconnection of genetics, racial politics, and aspirations for social repair at several interconnected sites. Knowledge derived from genetic science has increasingly been used to explain ever-growing aspects of the social world, as demonstrated by the proliferation of genetic genealogy testing. In the face of our growing faith in DNA, caution is warranted. A troubling reality of these reconciliation projects is the fact that the purposes to which DNA is put may be, in the words of Alvin Weinberg, trans-scientific. A nuclear physicist, Weinberg deployed the idea of trans science to forestall criticism of potentially dangerous research and to draw a line between politics and, quote, pure science, as he put it. She says, contra Weinberg, I take it as a given that science and its applications are inherently social and thus also political. But I nevertheless find Weinberg's insight to be of use at a time when genetic science is being asked to solve and resolve myriad issues. And this actually, I was struck. So our colleague, Dr. Jill Peltzer, I don't think she's on here, but she joins sometimes, actually sent, this is very timely, she sent this to myself and Dr. Glenn, that there's this roundtable discussion on January 25th about the promise and perils of social and behavioral genomics. And it's a panel discussion about kind of, what are our responsibilities? What are the social, potential social dangers? And I was looking through the biographies of the speakers, and actually one of the speakers was a co-author on this paper in Scientific American. Scientists must consider the risk of racist misappropriation of research. And they say that no well-intentioned researcher expects that their work will be used to justify violence. But following the racist massacre of 10 Black people in Buffalo, New York supermarket on May 14th, one of the co-authors, experienced just that. We join other researchers in condemning any use of genetics to justify racism or hate. In a rambling 180-page creed posted online just before the shooting, the Buffalo shooter appears to write so as to emulate an academic monograph. He cites recent developments in human molecular genetics to falsely assert that there are innate biological differences between races in an attempt to validate his hateful white supremacist worldview. Although misuse of science to support bigotry is not new, this latest atrocity is another wake-up call to geneticists and the scientific community at large to consider how we are conducting and communicating science and how we do these better. And so a quote, is that, so the first author, Robbie Weedo, actually was an author on this 2018 study. I was curious what it was, and it's actually this paper. The 2018 study cited by the shooter aimed to find genetic variation associated with years of completed schooling and cognition. It gathered DNA on 1 million people of predominantly European estimated genetic ancestry and sought to identify genetic variants correlated with outcomes, such as years of completed schooling and cognitive performance. Importantly, the genetic variants identified in the study, like any genomic study of a complex outcome, are time and context dependent. In a different time, place, and social structure, a different set of variants might emerge as statistically linked. Genes do not predestine. This is from the Scientific American article, they didn't say this in this Nature Genetics explicitly, but genes do not predestine one individual to complete fewer years of schooling than another, or one individual to score higher on a cognitive performance test than another. And so I think this is just showing how dangerous it is that unless these things are either explicitly stated, or our education has been such that you're able to understand, that this link does not exist between behavior or cognitive ability and race and genetics, that these can be misinterpreted.
Even the fact
So,
of conducting that study, right? Like that study isn't conducted in a vacuum. That hypothesis question about whether or not genes correlate with educational attainment, that doesn't happen in a vacuum either, right?
mhm.
Like that really happens only in the history of sort of our thinking and imaginings about genetics, right? And, particularly the long history of the eugenics movement, where, it was common sense to most people that, of course, genes played a role in educational attainment. Of course, genes played a role in how people performed on standardized tests, right? So to even perform this research, right, only happens within the context of a history of thinking about biological determinism and links between our genetics and our social position in society.
Right. And to be responsible, you need to, if you're, going to do something like this, you need to very explicitly, say that you're not buying into that history. You state the history, and it's like you need a warning label on it, like they've put now on Gone with the Wind. So this is the outtake from that Scientific American article where Weedo et al. They say it's time to rethink how we weigh the risks and benefits of research. So not that, not to intend to censor, but basically, what if we incentivized generations of scientists to prioritize considering social risk along with scientific impact, and the need for contextualizing, as you say, Dr. Glenn, in the history that we're all existing in? What if funding agencies asked scientists to plan for mitigating against potential social risks? And then ultimately, most importantly, what if we are taught genetics in a way that reflects actual human variation rather than incorrectly reflecting determinism? Do you want to take this one?
So this is the monument that was eventually erected at the African burial ground that was discovered in East Lower Manhattan in New York City. Um, Again, the sort of background behind this, there was plans to erect a new federal building at the site. And during excavation for the erection of the new federal building, they discovered a grave site. In doing historical research, they determined that this grave site dated back to the late 1600s and 1700s. And at that point in time, it was outside the actual city limits of New York. Um, and consulting old maps, they discovered that this was a historic African burial ground because at the time in New York City, slaves nor their descendants were allowed to be buried in any of the church cemeteries in New York. So they all had to be buried outside the city limits. And it was up on this ground where they found hundreds and hundreds of graves that dated back to this early colonial period. And the result was that the government determined that there are certain laws for how you treat burial grounds, and the community really got involved once learning that it was an African burial ground. And they got involved and really wanted to have a say in how the excavation was performed. They insisted that they really wanted to use methods that could illuminate the lived experiences of the people who were buried there. And first, it was a New Jersey company that was asked to do the excavation. They were particularly are using outdated methodologies, and their research questions were very narrow, kind of just trying to see if they could ascribe archaeological and anthropological race to the bones that they were unearthing. There was a lot of community outcry, also because of the way that they were handling the remains. And eventually, another team, sort of based at Howard University and some based at George Washington University, came in and took over direction of the excavation, the research, and the preservation of the remains that were unearthed. And there were historians, there were geneticists, archaeologists, and anthropologists who were all involved. The methods that got used to sort of tell the stories, beyond genetics, I think the genetics story is probably the most prevalent, but also like sort of archaeological dentistry, right? Looking at the resin remains on teeth that can tell us what we ate and from what part of the world some of that may have come from. And it was some of that evidence that was able to confirm that folks were actually coming from Western Africa in terms of the resin that was on their teeth. But this was also, I think most importantly, where Kittles, and I'm blanking on Kittles' first name, who's the CEO of AfricanAncestry.com, where he was brought in and ended up perfecting his technique for sequencing ancient DNA. They call ancient DNA anything over 200 years old. And of course, the problem with ancient DNA is that the DNA sequences are often broken. And he found methods of looking at only segments and being able to look at the specific markers on simple segments of DNA and able to match those markers to source populations that were that they began going around the world and sort of taking samples from. And all the baggage that comes with that, all the assumptions that come with that about whether or not those source populations have always been there, whether or not they're representative of everyone in that local community, etc. And the idea, as they initially reported it, right, is that this is a way that you can understand sort of your ethnic ancestry, but it's not the same as sort of racial ancestry. And even that, right, has caused a lot of confusion going forward. Like, so people ask, well, so if you're ethnically, right, come from the specific group in what is modern day Ghana, i.e. you're Black, damn it. Like, why are you parsing words? And that has been, I think, a large issue of contention and how people sort of understand this differently. Yes, there are historic geographic populations that we know if they're from certain parts of the world, they will have melanated skin. But that's very different than assuming that there are categorizations of the genome, of the whole genome, right, that demarcate, right, people of melanated skin from people of non-melanated skin and people of partially melanated skin, et cetera, and people with tight curly hair versus people with longer and straighter hair, et cetera, right? All the physiognomic properties that go into our popular notion thinkings of race. Is also worthy to note, right, that Kittles and the technology that he developed immediately saw economic opportunity in that, whereas a lot of the other researchers felt that this was something that should be available free to Black Americans and descendants of slaves living in the Americas. Of course, Kittles, he took his research and his methodology and packed up and went on his separate way and found Ancestry.com. But the result, for at least for the community in New York, right, was this monument. The Sankofa symbol there was actually chosen because on one of the coffins, they discovered that there were a number of nails that were nailed together in a pattern closely resembling that Sankofa symbol. And that was additional evidence that got used to help verify the idea that these were people who were born actually and reared in Africa before being brought to the United States as slaves. Anything I miss, Dr. Bridges?
I was just going to read just a final excerpt from the book, kind of talking about Sankofa. Nelson writes, in looking at the uses and abuses of genetic claims, one can only conclude that DNA is Janus-faced. Yet with genetic ancestry testing, these two ways of looking are also Sankofa. The Sankofa symbol of the Akan community of Ghana. When the burials were uncovered, as Dr. Glenn said, at the African burial ground in New York, one of the coffins had a heart-shaped symbol made of iron nails tacked on top. And this symbol, which some scholars believe to be Sankofa, was incorporated into the African burial ground monument. And a rendering of the design found on the coffin lid is the prominently carved into the granite memorial. The meaning of Sankofa has been differently interpreted, but those interpretations aptly converge around going back or looking back to something or sometime forgotten, and also importantly, as knowing about one's past in order to move ahead to the future. So we wanted to open up discussion with you all. Kind of what was on our mind was that question Dr. Glenn posed earlier: what is at stake in the debate over reparations? And then as individuals in the system of an academic medical center, what responsibility or what role do we have to not reinforce the idea of biological race? So I'll stop sharing so we can see each other.